Hey everyone, I'm Jp Szafron. This is Kitco News. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Well, the conversation around gold and silver has really shifted in 2024. It's not just about record highs in prices or hedging against inflation anymore. It's becoming a movement as states across the country are repealing taxes on precious metals, making it easier for individuals to invest in gold and silver as stable assets. But while that's happening, we're also seeing troubling economic signs. Credit card debt is piling up, and the resilient consumer narrative doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground. So what does all this mean? Can state-level changes really challenge national monetary policy, or are these just small victories in a much larger battle? Today, we've got Jp Cortez with us again. He is the executive director of the Sound Money Defense League. He's been working on these reforms for years. Will help us dig into what's happening on the ground. JP, welcome back to Kitco News. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me on, Jeremy. It's good to be back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, we had you on a few months ago with some developments within this, but for those that didn't watch our last episode together, maybe briefly explain this whole idea of sound money.
Sure. Yeah. So over the past decade, the Sound Money Defense League has been at the forefront of advocating for sound money. By sound money, what I mean is it's the principle that money should maintain its value over time, typically backed by something like gold and silver. This stands in stark contrast from what is called fiat money. This is unbacked money, typically printed by a government, doesn't have any real or intrinsic or asset backing up the value of the money. So this is money by government decree. So these assets, not backed by any physical asset, makes them vulnerable to inflation. It makes them susceptible to be weaponized by expedient politicians. Whereas sound money is resistant to inflation. So you preserve individual wealth, you provide long-term financial security, and individuals and societies get to make long-term plans.
Okay, well, there's lots to unpack here. It's been a jam-packed year for you guys. Since we last spoke, we've seen some legislative wins for sound money. Obviously, Nebraska and New Jersey both made different moves, though, they made some moves, but in very different ways. Nebraska, there was an attempt to reimpose a sales tax on gold and silver purchases. JP, why do you think states still occasionally try to reverse progress on sound money? And how did the grassroots action turn this around?
I'm sad to say that I think a big part of the reason why a state might reverse course after already having taken proactive steps towards sound money is largely one to do with tax revenue. The politicians that govern many of the states and here in DC in the United States are largely tax revenue hungry. And they see assets, they see individual sectors, they see entire industries as tax havens, as places where they could possibly take taxes out of. And so lawmakers have been seeing the massive fervor around sound money nationwide. And unfortunately, some of them are getting the idea, hey, wait, this looks like a cash cow for us. If we tax these assets, think about what the state's finances or what the state's coffers might look like. Of course, this is totally backwards. Studies have shown that imposing a sales tax on precious metals is an inefficient form of tax revenue collection. Because taxes are so easy to avoid in this particular space. If I live in one of the very few states that still charges a sales tax on precious metals, I wouldn't walk into a dealer in the state to be subject to a 5, 6, 7% sales tax on top of whatever the cost of my purchase is. I would simply go online. I would order from an online dealer and I would have it shipped to a depository, be it in Texas or in Idaho or in any other state that doesn't have a sales tax, because sales tax rules are largely dependent on the state of delivery. If your state doesn't have a sales tax on precious metals and you get the metals delivered to that state, there is no sales tax. So it's so simple to get around this tax, and lawmakers are unable to see that. And so this year, unfortunately, despite the fact that Nebraska earlier this year passed really profound sound money legislation that really moved the ball forward, the politicians there just couldn't help themselves. And so they introduced a large package bill that would have introduced a sales tax on a number of assets, a number of different industries, a number of different situations. And of course, upon hearing that news, we mobilized immediately. We contacted our people in the state of Nebraska and asked them to contact key members of the legislature, key members of the committee, and the bill sponsors, telling them, hey, this is not right. We should not be taxing precious metals. We should not be taking a step backwards in Nebraska, which is what they would have been doing. Only 5 states in the nation still charge a sales tax on precious metals. So this would have been walking in the exact opposite direction of the trend. And so it was largely a display of grassroots pressure. We have learned time and time again over the last 10 years that more than a cleverly written bill, more than experts putting on suits and going to testify before these committees, the importance of grassroots can't be understated. And hearing from people in the state is ultimately what determines the success of these legislative projects. And so I'm happy to say that in Nebraska, after earlier this year passing legislation that eliminates the capital gains on sales tax, eliminates the capital gains on precious metals. So if you sell your gold or silver and you enjoy a gain, you will not be taxed by the state. This is a bill that also reaffirmed gold and silver as money in the state of Nebraska by statute. And it also reaffirmed that CBDCs are not considered money and cannot be hoisted upon the citizens of Nebraska. So this was a monumental but very important bill that Nebraska passed earlier this year. And then they followed up with this attempt to reimpose taxes, which was ultimately shut down by the people in the state who increasingly are viewing gold and silver less as investments and more as money itself.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's been a fascinating movement to watch. Okay, let's switch over to New Jersey. You know, it was a pretty significant win. I think the state became the 45th to remove sales tax on precious metals. But JP, to explain this poor tax, this introduction of transactions under $1,000, I mean, it seems to undermine the spirit of that law.
You are absolutely right. You couldn't be more right. This is an entirely regressive attempt to harm the small-time purchasers of precious metals. Like you mentioned, this bill in New Jersey that was signed into law just a few weeks ago by Governor Murphy included what we call an anti-poor tax, an anti-poor amendment in the actual bill. So the bill itself says that any transactions under $1,000 are still subject to New Jersey's 6.5% sales tax. But what lawmakers don't see is how this harms the smallest savers among us. The argument is that if you're making a purchase that size, it's likely going to art or to be worked into some sort of collectible display. But that's not the case. In many cases, these are people who are dollar cost averaging, who are going to their local precious metals dealer and buying a couple of silver eagles, a couple of silver rounds every paycheck. And this tax harms them. It actively picks them out and says that, no, you cannot buy precious metals without being subject to penalty by the state. So while New Jersey's win is huge, and I don't want to understate that, this is a huge win in New Jersey. Just earlier this year, the governor of New Jersey vetoed a very similar bill. This is a multi-year project where I personally have been traveling to Trenton, New Jersey, to testify before these committees. And there are a million arguments as to why sales taxes shouldn't be imposed on purchases of precious metals. And I'm going and making several of these arguments. One of the strongest ones has to be that New Jersey treats gold and silver differently than it does any other asset. In any case, if you buy stocks, bonds, ETFs, if you're in the state of New Jersey and you open your Schwab account or your E-Trade account to buy a stock, you're not going to be charged a sales tax on that asset. That's because the gain is what's taxed. But in the state of New Jersey and in a handful of other states here in the United States, that's not the case. They'll charge you when you buy the asset, they'll charge you when you sell the asset, and then the feds will charge you a third time on a capital gain. So the environment of taxation around these assets, it's intentionally. You have to believe that the reason that gold and silver are being saddled with this sort of discriminatory regulation and discriminatory taxation is because the powers that be don't want it to be used as money. Because that's the reality. Gold and silver, it's not that they failed as money. It's not that the gold standard failed. It's that so many impediments were placed upon them that they cannot functionally be used as money anymore. And so this win in New Jersey highlights this movement that is going towards the realization that more than any other reason, more than any other cause, the reason that gold and silver aren't functional as money right now is because of the friction that taxes introduce. So by removing these taxes, I think what you'll see is more people adopting their own personal gold standard. And that's important because, I'm sorry, running off on a little tangent here, but I think, when we talk about precious metals and we talk about people adopting their own gold standard, a very common question that comes is, okay, well, how do you reimpose a gold standard? Does Congress pass a law? Does the Federal Reserve have to do something? What has to happen? And I think that a question like that even fundamentally misses the point. A gold standard doesn't have to be imposed by a central government or by someone with a bullhorn, because gold and silver are in fact money themselves. We don't need a national framework to determine what is and isn't money, or what money is or isn't valued at. We simply need the government to get the hell out of the way and allow people to transact using the monies that have been money for thousands of years.
Yeah, I like that. I can see it as a headline, get the hell out of the way. Okay, well then, to your point, JP, let's talk about what's happening in Utah. I mean, we're seeing ongoing discussions around holding physical gold on the state's balance sheet. Obviously, huge news here with gold hitting all-time highs. How significant is this move as a hedge against this whole dollar instability play?
This is a huge step forward. Taxes, like I mentioned, are our first priority. But after taxes, this has to be the next step that takes place. Empowering state treasurers and state financiers to invest state funds in physical gold and silver would be a huge step towards sound money. The truth is that the vast majority, almost all states, do not have a single ounce of gold in their state holdings, do not have a single ounce on their books. But in many cases, they have third world debt. They have risky stocks and CDs that, in many cases, are offering negative returns, with real rates of inflation being what they are. In many cases, these assets that are being held by the state have a negative real rate of return. And so the states empowering themselves to invest and save, preserve their coffers and their treasuries in gold and silver is a huge step forward. Now, it's not just this investment, which in Utah's case, I believe, was approved for $180 million that the state that the legislature has approved for the state to purchase. And my understanding, in speaking with the bill sponsors, is that the first tranche of that investment will be coming soon. But on top of just the purchase and the bolstering of the state's balance sheet is sort of what comes next. As part of this bill that passed earlier this year, the legislation called for a study that is actually supposed to be reported or supposed to be released in October. So just a few weeks from now, we are, weeks away from hearing the results of a study that called for, and I'll read this exactly from the bill. The bill was called to conduct a study analyzing the role of precious metals in augmenting, stabilizing, and ensuring the economic security and prosperity of the state, the families and residents of the state, and businesses in the state. So we're talking about more than just individuals. We're talking about how states themselves now are bracing for potential dollar instability. And like you mentioned, right, this is happening at the time where gold is hitting all-time highs. Gold now is into the mid 2600s. And it's so crazy to think that in states like Idaho and states like Wyoming and in several of these states across the country, where in 2017, we were going around begging to have legislation introduced, telling state lawmakers, hey, right now your treasurer doesn't even explicitly have the right to invest in gold and silver if they want to. It would be very prudent for you to empower your state treasurer to do that in case the state ever determines that it needs to do this. While we were running around with that legislation, begging people to introduce it, gold was closing at an average in 2017 of $1,260 an ounce. It has since more than doubled. And the lawmakers that thumbed their nose up or that, said crazy things like, oh, gold has no yield, we can't invest in gold, or brokers that said, oh, we can't collect brokerage fees on gold, so we don't recommend gold. These people have been derelict in their duty in their fiduciary responsibility to the state and to the people of the state, these people should be ashamed and embarrassed for not being a first adopter and a first mover on something that has been around for 5,000 years. And it's only the last 50 years that the technocrats and politicians have really voiced the hubris of, no, we don't need a standard. We can handle money. With our complicated regressions, with our calculus, we can figure this out. And that is completely backwards. And the price of gold is just one of the things that is actively proving that today.
Yeah, JP, I mean, you talked, to your point, there's been a recent announcement of the largest gold depository in North America's history being built, bigger than Fort Knox. So I guess, as we see consumers jumping to Costco to buy gold and we see this demand really building up, do you see this as a signal for that demand continuing to grow? Or is it, an investment, or is it more of a hedge against systemic risks?
I think it is a huge bullish signal for gold and silver, for retail, for wholesale, for personal use, and for use as money in general. I think that when you have demand that surpasses Fort Knox, you're really onto something here. What you're talking about there is Money Metals. Money Metals Exchange recently announced their brand new depository. It's a Class 3 depository in the state of Idaho that is larger than Fort Knox, the stronghold at the U.S. Army base in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And this is more than a state establishing a depository funded by taxpayers. This is a private business that has decided that there is a legitimate business case for establishing, for building, for pouring millions of dollars into this fortress that is, set to store metals for individuals, for states, for institutions, for countries. And so I think that this is just one of the many signals that gold and silver we're in the middle of a real renaissance, a real awakening, that maybe this paper money that we've been hanging on to, that our experts and that our bettors have told us that is, it is solid and it can be trusted. People are waking up to the reality that may not be the case, Jeremy.
Yeah, other nations certainly too. I mean, you've spoken about de-dollarization on both global and domestic scales. We're seeing BRICS countries moving away from the US dollar. But as you mentioned, there's also that individuals and states are hedging against the dollar. So how much of the shift is driven by self-imposed US policies? And where does gold fit into this picture here?
Frankly, I think the majority of it has to be self-imposed. When we look at what has happened, I think one of the main things that I take away is that when the dollar loses its global reserve currency status, whenever that is, and when the dollar ultimately dies, I think the eulogies written about the dollar should say rather, they very well may not say this, but the eulogies in their history books written about the US dollar should say that the US dollar was killed by politicians who first had the hubris to detach it from any link of gold or any sort of standard, and then weaponized it so as to invite neighboring countries, to invite allies, to invite enemies to seek alternatives. That is what the gravestone of the US dollar should say, that this was self-imposed, that after decades of weaponizing monetary policy for example, kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, for taking assets and claiming them as their own, taking them from whether it be enemies or allies, it makes a lot of sense. The trend of people seeking alternatives to a dollar that's been weaponized for several decades now makes total sense to me, and we're actively seeing that play out. Right, I think it was Jan Nieuwenhuis, who is an excellent gold analyst, who recently published something, and I think Groman and Taleb have also been vocal on this issue as well, about how, if you look, you can chart this out. Global central bank gold holdings across the world have been steadily increasing for quite a while now, while US dollar denominated assets have been stagnating. So it's a question of countries themselves. So internationally, but also domestically, more and more people are seeking alternatives to the exposure that they have to the greenback. That's not an accident. That didn't happen because this is largely the fault of a weaponized currency. And the people around the world, the countries around the world, have seen what the United States has done with the great privilege and power that comes with being the world's reserve currency, and they understandably don't like it. So, I'm not saying that the dollar will die tomorrow, but this is death by 1,000 cuts, and it's slowly teetering towards what is the obvious result of weaponization and manipulation of the global reserve currency.
Yeah, it's been so fascinating. And of course, we talked to a lot of economists here at Kitco News, and we've had people argue both sides of this. I don't think the US dollar is going anywhere anytime soon. But to your point, you're talking about nations like Russia transacting in gold with Chinese suppliers, looking to these global alternatives to the US dollar. In your opinion, if this continues, it could take hold sooner than expected.
I think it certainly could. And I think that the reasons for why people, individuals, and other countries would be seeking alternatives is clear. And I think that, as inflation continues with interest rates manipulation here, it's only a matter of time before we see the next surge of inflation, and countries, allies, and otherwise, more and more will be seeking alternatives. And that's why this stuff that we're doing here in the States is so important, because it's not necessarily, like I mentioned, we're not necessarily trying to establish a national gold standard again, but to create the infrastructure and to give people and institutions the space to transact in physical gold if they choose to, the space to invite competition into the monetary system, which is ultimately what gives us the highest quality goods at the most available price, right? The competition in money is something that we haven't had in decades, and we have the academia, the scholarship of why this is important, right? Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek wrote about denationalizing currency and why it's important to treat money not as a special good, but as any other good that can compete on the market. And the ones with the greatest monetary attributes will ultimately win out. And I think that that's what we need in the space of money. And I think that hopefully that's what we are attempting to do with all of this state legislature.
Yeah, well done. I mean, to your point, obviously we talk a lot here at Kitco News about the economy with different economists, but mainstream narratives in the media have painted the U.S. economy as quite resilient. But the reality on the ground is a little bit different here. I mean, credit card debt reached $1.142 trillion in Q2. It's the highest since tracking began. Obviously, there's a lot of debt going on. How does this play into the push for sound money? And are people starting to wake up to the need for this financial reform?
Well, it speaks to the importance and the urgency of sound money. Like you mentioned, Americans are saddled. And despite, the experts and the mainstream media and pundits telling us that, there's a very rosy picture of the economy, if you're willing to dig a little deeper, you'll find that that's not the case. Americans are drowning under credit card debt. American savings are at an all-time low. During COVID in 2020, 2021, American savings reached the highest level that they'd ever reached in American history since this metric had started to be tracked. And now, just 2 or 3 years later, Americans have spent all that money and then some, have gone further into debt. And the horribleness of credit card debt, man, Jeremy, you're talking about 28%. That Americans are, willingly, or at least because they have no other choice, they have to enter these financial arrangements and agreements that are totally unsustainable for the American family. And so for the American family, for the American consumer, and of course, all of that plays into geopolitics and globally how the global economy is doing. So, the quote unquote resilient consumer, the resilient consumer is drowning in debt. What resilient consumer? I don't know what you're talking about. But what I can say assuredly is that gold is shining brighter than it has ever shined before, and that gold as money has been the case for thousands of years. And it behooves us to come back to that because, like you mentioned, it's very easy to talk about numbers and metrics and this sort of like esoteric, far away idea of what the economy, quote unquote, is. But if you stop treating the economy like a science project and you view it as actual individuals that are acting and interacting with one another, you have to see the monetary system in the United States as nothing less than a crime. These people, in many cases, can't afford housing or food or medicine or transport. And the American economy is actively making it harder for people struggling. And so it speaks to the importance of gold and silver, right? The reason that gold and silver make good money is not by government decree. It's not by executive order. It's not by government edict. It's because they've had strong monetary properties for thousands of years. And until we come back to that, we will continue this cycle. And until we reject the principle of paper money, this nightmare will continue.
Yeah. And to your point, U.S. consumer confidence just fell to a 3-year low on the labor side of things, too. That was just out this morning. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what the critics argue. Obviously, they argue that reintroducing gold and silver as money could lead to increased market volatility, but also a bifurcated currency system. How do you address these concerns?
I don't think a bifurcated currency system is necessarily a bad thing. Globally, there are dozens of currencies, the euro, the pound, the dollar. There are plenty of alternatives as far as, different monetary instruments that people could use transactionally as money. But I think importantly, ultimately, that's what we want. I don't want a bifurcated monetary system. I want a trifurcated monetary system. I want as many possible individuals, as many possible entrepreneurs and smart people working individually in their own spaces to try to solve these answers of money. And that's kind of the beauty of a marketplace and kind of the beauty of the American system, in that like each state has its own individual rules and its own individual sort of guidelines. And so each state becomes its own sandbox. We can conduct 50 different experiments at the same time to determine which avenue or which asset or which good is best. And it's so important, I think, to do those experiments, because we don't know. We can't possibly know. The hubris of humanity will make it so that, your central bankers, your PhDs in economics will tell you, oh, if you tinker with this knob, or if you just run this regression, we can figure it out. But the truth is, there's no reality to that. And what we need is as many experiments as possible going on at one time to figure out ultimately which is the best money. My money is on gold and silver. I encourage the technocrats and the politicians to continue pushing their paper money, because I sincerely believe that, when the bout ends, gold and silver will be the winner.
Yeah. Before I let you go here, JP, let's talk about, we've been talking a lot about state politics in terms of reforms, but what about the feds? I mean, federal reforms for sound money seem to be lagging behind state efforts. Congressman Alex Mooney reintroducing key legislation here. How likely is it that we'll see federal level tax reforms on gold and silver?
I maintain, I am hopeful that this is something that happens over time. I think that Mooney and Congressman Mooney and the legislators that came before him are doing, they're doing God's work, in that they're carrying a conversation forward. If I'm being completely honest, I'm not necessarily hopeful that federal legislation will work its way through the process and ultimately President Biden or President whoever will sign a bill into law saying that gold and silver are money as prescribed by the U.S. Constitution. I'm not necessarily hopeful that that will happen, but the work that Congressman Mooney is doing by continuing to shine a light on, like you mentioned earlier this year, he reintroduced legislation that would federally end the capital gains tax on precious metals, right? So what we're doing state to state, Mooney's bill would just completely eliminate that. And the reason most states charge that capital gains is because the feds do. So if you eliminate the tax on the federal level, most states would follow suit, and that tax would be eliminated as well. So to do that on the federal level would have huge implications for what we're doing. But honestly, I'm not necessarily hopeful that that will be the case. We've mentioned before, I think last time we spoke, we talked about how the reason for the tax structure around gold and silver, at least on the federal level, is not one that happened statutorily. It happened with the IRS. The IRS unilaterally decided that gold and silver are collectibles subject to a 28% tax, similar to Beanie Babies and artwork. So the continuing to shine a light on the feds is important. removing this tax is important. Another huge thing that Mooney has done would be to call for an audit of all of America's gold holdings. Any encumbrances, any gold that is stored by the US but potentially owned or encumbered by a different country, any swaps, leases, anything regarding the IMF. So these are very, robust pieces of legislation that Congressman Mooney has introduced, and there have been several pieces of legislation over several years. Like I mentioned, I'm not necessarily hopeful that the bills will pass, but by continuing to lend a microphone on the federal level to these issues of sound money, Congressman Mooney is taking up the torch from Ron Paul, from Thomas Massie, from the legislators that came before them that understood that the Constitution calls for gold and silver as money, but also generally understand history and understand that debasing money is the quickest road to the complete collapse of an empire.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not these state-level victories can truly pressure federal lawmakers into action. Obviously, still a little ways to go. We appreciate you coming on. Jp Cortez, he's the executive director of the Sound Money Defense League. Continue to buy gold instead of Beanie Babies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Thanks, JP. I appreciate your time for this today.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I'm Jeremy Szafron for all of us here at Kitco News. Thank you for watching. We've got a great week of economic data, more analysts coming up, and some great opinions. Stay with us. We'll see you soon.